In this video, I will be explaining the schedules of reinforcement in applied behavior analysis. Let's start with what reinforcement is. I talked a little bit about this on the introduction page of my blog. Reinforcement involves consequences that follow a behavior. To strengthen a behavior means to increase its likelihood to occur again in the future. Reinforcement can be both positive and negative. In this video, a dog sits and is presented with a treat. He'll be more likely to sit for a treat in the future. This is an example of positive reinforcement. Now let's get started with schedules of reinforcement. A schedule of reinforcement is a rule stating which instances of behavior will be reinforced varying on the number of responses, the time between responses, and stimulus conditions. Schedules of reinforcement can be broken down into three extreme subcategories: extinction being the least reinforcing and continuous being the most. Extinction is the discontinuing of a previously reinforced behavior. The behavior no longer exists. For example, if I stop giving my dog a treat each time he sits, he will eventually stop sitting. Intermittent reinforcement is when some responses are reinforced and others are not. An example of this could be, I sometimes take my kids to get ice cream after they clean their rooms, but sometimes I don't. And lastly, continuous reinforcement occurs after each instance of a response. The behavior is reinforced every single time. My dog gets a treat every time he sits. Intermittent reinforcement is broken down by interval, which is time, and ratio, the amount of times. It is then broken down even more using fixed and variable schedules. Fixed means that it occurs at a fixed amount of time or a number of times, and variable means that reinforcement varies after a random amount of time or number of times. The first schedule we're going to look at is called a fixed ratio schedule. This type of reinforcement occurs when a fixed number of responses is required for reinforcement. This schedule also produces a high and steady rate of responses before reinforcement. An example could be delivering a food pellet to a rat every 5 times it pushes a lever. So essentially, 5 pushes equals 1 food pellet. In a fixed interval schedule, reinforcement occurs after a fixed amount of time. This type of schedule produces an overall low rate of responding. This time, for the example, the rat receives a food pellet after every 5 minutes. So 5 minutes equals 1 food pellet. Moving on to variable ratio reinforcement. This is when reinforcement occurs after a random number of responses. This schedule produces the highest and steadiest rate of responses. When I think about variable ratio schedules, I think about spending time at a casino. A slot machine pays out after a random number of tries. I can see why this is very addicting. The last schedule of reinforcement is variable interval reinforcement. In this schedule, reinforcement occurs after a random amount of time. It also produces a pretty steady rate of responses. I love to go fishing, and this is the perfect example for variable interval reinforcement. A fisherman catches a fish immediately after casting and then doesn't catch another fish for an hour. In this example, the amount of time before reinforcement is random. The last slide shows a graph of the rates of responding for each schedule of reinforcement. The graph shows that the variable ratio presents the highest rate of responses and the fixed interval presents the lowest rate of responses. This is referred to as the scallop effect. Notice how the line looks scalloped. This occurs when responding is very low or non-existent immediately following reinforcement and then rapidly increases just before another reinforcement is due. An example that I find myself doing quite often is cramming for an exam. Normally, after my professors assign a final exam at the beginning of a semester, I study a little each week and then I rapidly increase my studying the night before the exam. And lastly, I have my sources. I hope you've enjoyed learning about the schedules of reinforcement with me.